Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the Kellogg Institute's lecture series. My name is Abby Cordova, and I'm an associate professor in the QS School and a faculty fellow at Kellogg. I would like to thank everyone at Kellogg for making this event possible. And really, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Dara Cohen to Kellogg and Notre Dame. Dr. Cohen is a Ford Foundation Associate Professor of Public Policy at the Kennedy School at Harvard University. Her research and teaching interests include topics related to international security, civil war, and the dynamics of violence and gender and conflict. Her first book, entitled Rape During Civil War, is the recipient of multiple awards that I cannot list all here for the sake of time, and is highly cited in the literature. She has also published widely in the highest ranked journals in political science, including the American Political Science Review, International Organization, and World Politics. Today, she will be sharing with us the finding of her second book, co-authored with Danielle Hahn. And her book is entitled, Lynching and Local Justice, Legitimacy and Accountability in Weak States, published last year with Cambridge University Press. So we will give a chance to Dr. Cohen to give us a presentation on her book, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience. So welcome to Notre Dame and Kellogg. Dara, please go ahead with your presentation. We look forward to it.
Great. Thank you so much, Abby, for inviting me to share this, this book, this new work. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And thank you so much to everyone for coming today. I see some familiar faces in the audience, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So what I'll be talking about today is this new book, which came out last fall, entitled Lynching and Local Justice, Legitimacy and Accountability in Weak States. And this is co-authored work with Danielle Jung, as Abby mentioned, who is an associate professor of political science at Emory University. So I'll go ahead and get started by just taking a little bit of a step back, thinking about the problem of lynching. And I'll say a little bit more about how we define this in our book. But when I'm talking about lynching, what I'm talking about are acts of lethal violence or violence which the participants could be assumed to think might be lethal. Violence that is extralegal, which is to say, outside the normal rule of law, and violence that is typically committed by groups of people with the intention to punish offenses to a community. So I thought I would just start by showing how broad and widespread the problem of lynching is in the contemporary world. So here on this slide are several examples from recent years that are from different regions of the world, different countries, different cultures. And also, I think it's important to note from the developed world and from the developing world, right? So here is a story from BBC News about a suspected drug dealer who was tarred and feathered in broad daylight in Belfast by local people who were frustrated that the police had failed to act on information about someone who was selling drugs. There has recently been, well, in the past 5 years or so, a lot of coverage of Brazil that many observers say was really engulfed in what some called a lynching epidemic, largely of perpetrators of petty theft. By one estimate, an expert estimated that there was an average of one death by mob violence every 2 days in the country. And lastly is the example of India, which in 2018 and 2019 also experienced a wave of lynchings, in this case, seemingly fueled by social media, by rumors from social media, in response to a variety of perceived social ills. For example, child abductions, crimes, and cow vigilantism as well. So this slide just shows us really the really quite broad global scope of lynching in the contemporary world. One of the things that Danielle and I wanted to do as we started out writing this book and thinking about the problem of lynching and collective vigilantism was just to try to develop a data set. There really wasn't an existing cross-national data set that looked at lynching and related practices all around the world in the contemporary period. So one of the first things that we did when we started this project was to use a standard source, which is used by many quantitative human rights scholars, which is the annual report that's issued by the US State Department called the Human Rights Country Report. And it's issued for every country and every year. And so using this report, we then coded all of the mentions of acts of lynching according to the definition I provided earlier, and other forms of collective vigilantism. And as you can see here, it is really has been reported all over the world, right? It is not limited to a particular country. It's not limited to a particular region. One thing I do want to note is that the US State Department does not report on human rights practices in the United States itself. It's the only country that's absent from the US State Department reports. So if it were to be included, we would also see the United States colored in black here, indicating that there were reports in this period. But it's not in the source that we used. A few other patterns that emerged from these cross-national data. And I think some of these patterns are really important because they shed light on why some of the most common arguments or some of the conventional wisdoms about lynching are wrong or are biased or are flawed, right? First, as we show in the beginning of our book, these reports of lynching are not limited to only the weakest states. And as we show in statistical analysis, they're also not closely correlated with levels of poverty on the national level or with levels of development, right? And so all of these are kind of common stories that we tell about why lynching emerges in some states and not others. So at the beginning of the book, we sort of present this, but then we really argue that in order to understand variation in why lynching happens in some places and not others, we actually have to get away from the cross-national level. We think the most important variation and really the kind of key insights about why lynching happens are really at the subnational level, right? And so we turn instead to look at what we call micro-level contestation over issues of legitimacy. Not just the presence of state authority, as I'll return in just a minute, but the issues of legitimacy of the state on the sort of hyper-local level. And to do that, we really need to turn to case studies and kind of get away from comparing states to other states. So to do that in this book, we really focus in on the case of Haiti. So I want to say a few words about why we selected Haiti as the case that we focus on in the book. First is that Haiti is really a fascinating example of widespread criminality against a landscape of a deeply fragmented state. And so it presents some interesting opportunities for researchers who are curious about what happens when the state recedes from particular neighborhoods and criminal violence kind of grows in its place. So that's the first reason. A second reason is that Danielle and I are both primarily scholars of civil war. We both are scholars of political violence, but really come from studying the context of civil war. And one thing that we've become increasingly interested in are contexts where countries are not coded as being at war, but neither are they truly at peace. Right? We're both really interested in this kind of gray area where there are very high numbers of fatalities, but they're often invisible from standard political science data sets because that violence, those acts of lethal violence are not committed by the groups that political scientists really consider to be kind of political armed groups, the groups that we primarily study as political scientists. So Danielle and I were both interested in this case because the violence that we're primarily concerned with here is violence that's committed by gangs. And also, I think it's important to say, violence that's committed by ordinary people, right? Lynching and other forms of collective vigilantism are by definition not committed by people by actors that are specialists in violence, but rather just what we often call ordinary people, right? A third reason that we wanted to focus on Haiti is that gang violence and gang governance are just major issues for the country, and primarily also for Port-au-Prince, the capital city, which is where our study is focused. Major issues that have implications not only for the country, but also for the region, including, of course, the United States. And so some examples of that here are, first, this tweet from October of 2020. This is a Miami Herald reporter who covers Haiti. And in this tweet, she notes that the US ambassador to the UN was telling the Security Council in October that she is deeply concerned about armed gangs in Haiti. And so that's an example of just how top of mind it is for policymakers. Similarly, there have been some recent news stories, including as recently as last month in the New York Times, about how the security situation in Haiti is rapidly deteriorating, right? So the New York Times noted that Haiti is on the verge of an explosion, in part as a result of fighting between gangs, but also because it's on the verge of or it's in the midst, I should say, of a constitutional crisis. There are many, many violent protests. And there's also been a really concerning increase in reports of kidnapping of ordinary people for ransom. And so Haiti is at a particularly fragile moment right now. I do want to say, I'll say more about our study in just a moment, but I don't think we would have been able to conduct our study now. We conducted it a couple of years ago. That also is a limitation on the study, that the sort of situation that we conducted our survey in was at a little bit of a calmer state moment in time than the current situation in Port-au-Prince. A couple more reasons on why we selected the case. Haiti is a really, and I think I say this from the perspective of a political violence scholar and a political scientist, it's really curiously understudied and neglected by political scientists and by political violence scholars. And I think this is curious because of its proximity to the US and also its deep historical connections to the United States. And I think this is really a missed opportunity for me and for scholars like me who are curious about some of the questions that we have studied here. There are studies of gangs and gang violence in Haiti, but these are largely dominated by anthropologists, many of whom are doing really incredible work, particularly very intensive participant observation. But there's a lack of comparative work across cases and across types of armed groups. And that's really the lens that Danielle and I are bringing to this book and to the larger set of projects that we've written about Haiti, coming from the study of civil wars and rebel groups. And lastly, I'll just say that lynching and vigilante killings are also very common in the context in contemporary Port-au-Prince. And this too is really dramatically understudied. In fact, there's really one major UN report. I've included a headline here from when it came out several years ago. But there's a lot we really don't understand about the causes and consequences of vigilante violence, despite how common it is in this context. All right, so one of the first things we needed to do when we started focusing on questions of lynching and vigilante violence in Port-au-Prince was to collect some data on how common it is. This was very challenging. And so one of the sources that we ended up using to try to get a snapshot of what's happening in contemporary Port-au-Prince was to rely on this really incredible data set that is collected by a local NGO called GLAP. And GLAP has reporters in all neighborhoods of Port-au-Prince, where their reporters provide qualitative information on a quarterly basis and have done so for almost 20 years, where they report on all kinds of on all forms of deaths and lethal violence. And so we took these qualitative reports, made them into quantitative data, translated them from Haitian Creole to English. And from these data, we're able to look at the approximately 400 deaths that were identified in this data set as deaths that were due to lynching and collective vigilantism. I do want to say that these 405 deaths over this period of about 15 years is definitely an undercount, right? And just one illustration of that, I mentioned before this UN report, the only major report that's been issued about lynching in the Haitian context. But in their report, they estimate that in just the year 2012 to 2015 alone, which is fully encompassed by the data that we've collected, they estimate that there were 483 lynchings or attempted lynchings. We don't collect data on attempted lynching, so the data doesn't quite match, but it just goes to show that this is a very common problem and we really lack clear data. But it's one sort of illustration of how common of a problem it is this UN report also estimates that about 15% of homicides in this period were due to lynching and other forms of collective vigilantism. But despite the differences in the N in terms of the numbers of lynchings, the patterns that we found in our data and that the UN reports in its report are very similar, right? We've both find that this is a common form of violence that is committed largely by young men against young men. So about 97% of lynching victims were men. And it's mainly committed as a response to petty crimes, right? And particularly to theft. And this also sheds light on the patterns of victimization. So most of the people who are suspected or believed to have committed property crimes are young men, right? This is why they are also targeted for lynching. And finally, I think we do a number of, we look at all different sources of variation when it comes to lynching in this context, but I think one really interesting source of variation is to look at the method of killing, right? And many of the common methods of lynching, including stoning and beating, actually require large numbers of people, right? And this gets back to the kind of importance of lynching as a form of collective violence, a form of group violence, which I think also sheds light on how it becomes so entrenched in a community. It's something that's witnessed by very many people. There are many participants of various types. So it helps us understand why it becomes accepted and legitimized in a community. So to give an overview of what we do in the book, we really ask two major questions. The first is to think about what some of the social and political consequences of poor state governance and weak state legitimacy are, and then to connect these ideas to lynching. So we ask, under what conditions does lynching, which again is we're defining as a form of collective vigilantism, become accepted and widespread in a local community? And our answer is essentially that when authority is either contested or ambiguous, as it is in many of the neighborhoods that we studied in Port-au-Prince, this can lead to mass punishment, which is to say, lynching, that has certain features, right? That is brutally violent, that is public, that is committed by groups. We also argue that which actors provide governance can affect which actors are seen as legitimate by the public. And this in turn has an effect on public support for lynching, right? And so we end up arguing in the book that approval for lynching by the public in the communities that we study is most likely under three conditions. First, when the state has failed to provide governance, and I should say that we're really as I'll say on the next slide, we're defining governance as the provision of basic social services. So when the state has failed to provide governance, we see an increase in approval for lynching. When non-state actors, which in this context are gangs, have provided governance or social services, and when communities have been essentially abandoned by everyone, right? And when they end up having to provide governance and social services for themselves. And so under those three conditions, that's where we see highest support and public approval for lynching. So just to put a finer point on some of the definitions of terms that I'll be using, I've already defined for you how we're thinking about lynching and collective vigilantism in this context. Legitimacy, is one of those terms in political science that has a million different definitions. The way we're thinking about it in this particular context is as a form of rightful rule in which there is a broad collective acceptance of who a leader is in a particular context. And finally, when thinking about governance, that's another one of those terms that has many, many definitions. But in this context, we're thinking about it as authority in a social or political relationship in which one actor, there's some typos here, complies with the decisions of another actor, right? And in this context, we're operationalizing this as thinking about which actors are providing basic social services to communities. One of the things, I'll say a bit more about each of these in just a moment, but we use multi-method research design in this context, particularly surveys and focus groups. We conduct what I think one of the more interesting parts of this book is a census of basic social service provision by a variety of different actors. And I think the core argument of the book is that we end up showing that there's a correlation between weak formal institutions and public support for collective vigilantism or lynching. And I think one of the most important findings here is that we find this relationship even when we're looking at weak formal institutions that are completely unrelated to the rule of law, right? So who provides sanitation actually has a consequence for the public support for lynching and collective vigilantism. And ultimately, I think our argument helps shed light on the practice of lynching and why it's so difficult to combat. All right, so just taking a quick step back and thinking about some of the background and context for lynching in gangs. I could give an hour-long talk on each of these, but I'll just say something very brief about both of these. Lynching is something that is not necessarily new in the Haitian context, but there have been more contemporary increases, including a rise during the period of the rule by the Duvaliers. And during the period of Aristide. And in the Aristide period, there was also an increase of particular forms of lynching, including something called necklacing, which was involved putting a tire around a victim and lighting it on fire. And so this was a sort of symbolic method of lynching during the Aristide era. That method is not so common these days, but more recently, there have been increased reporting of lynching, particularly during periods of extreme unrest and social anxiety. And so, for example, during the cholera outbreak in 2010, there were some increased reports of lynching where certain subpopulations who were thought to be responsible for spreading cholera were targeted, et cetera. Similarly, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, there has been a rise in gang violence, but gangs also are not necessarily new. Many observers trace the contemporary rise in gang violence back to the Aristide era, where Aristide provided weapons to local groups in exchange for their support. This is all against the backdrop, a very complex backdrop where local elites and gangs, and in some cases law enforcement, are colluding. And so this gets back to what I was saying earlier about really a very fragmented context, a very fragmented state. All right, so in this particular project, as I said before, we used a mixed method research design. The core of this was a survey that we conducted of about 1,000 adult respondents in Port-au-Prince in July of 2017. It was a household survey that took about an hour to conduct. We partnered with a local survey company. And so we had local enumerators go into each of the areas and do these face-to-face surveys. And in the survey, we were asking a variety of different questions, some of which ended up in the book, some of which ended up in some subsequent papers, asking respondents about their perceptions and attitudes towards security in their neighborhoods, about the Haitian state, about the local gangs in their neighborhoods, and also this census of service provision. And we complemented this survey with a series of focus groups with adult residents in some of the gang-affected neighborhoods. We talked to about 50 individuals total through a variety of different types of focus groups, all men, all women, some mixed gender focus groups, done over a series of fieldwork trips. And these were really quite challenging, both logistically and ethically. And so I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A if folks are interested in talking about that. I'll just say a few quick words. Some of the complexities here had to do with the fact that there is no recent census that we could use to draw a sample. And so we ended up drawing a sample based on commune level exposure to lethal violence using the data set that I mentioned a little bit earlier. And we drew a sample based on the probability proportionate to exposure to violence at the commune level. And our goal here was to try to gain a variation in exposure to violence, thinking about exposure to violence as a proxy for exposure to gangs. I will say something just very briefly about some ethical challenges, in part because these ethical challenges also shape the way we approached the project. And so in asking people about gangs, we confronted a number of challenges. And I say this because, Danielle and I both came from a context where we are more familiar with studying rebel groups in Civil War contexts. And in those contexts, it's not it's really not a gray area of whether someone served in a rebel group or not, right? It's sort of, did you serve in the rebel group or not, yes or no? But in this context, whether someone is in a gang or affiliated with a gang and what a gang is even is highly contested, right? And so gangs in this context, and I think in many contexts, are very hard to define. And the definition of a gang even varies by neighborhood. And so what we found in some of the field work that we did prior to fielding our survey was that what a gang is even varies by who you're asking, right? And so there are three types of armed non-state actors that I think as observers we would call gangs or gang-esque groups. These are in Haitian Creole called bas, bandi, and brigades. Bas essentially means a base or a group of friends. Bandi is the Creole word for bandit or thief, and brigade is more of a self-defense group. But we found that there was a tendency to call the gang in your own neighborhood a bas, right? The kind of more innocuous term, but a very similar group in a different neighborhood often would be called bandi or bandits. And so this makes it quite hard to ask about in a survey. And so we ended up asking about all three types. And then we aggregated in our book when we had to report on gangs. In terms of ethics, we also found that the enumerators who were quite experienced in asking questions in the neighborhoods where they were conducting these surveys also gave us some advice about how to approach, particularly asking questions about bandi, right? They didn't feel comfortable having the word bandi in their actual survey, right? So in their tablet, because in the past they knew that members of gangs would actually ask to see the survey that they were fielding in the gang controlled areas. And so they actually innovated something that I thought was really creative, which is to, in the actual survey instrument, to use an alternate term for bandi, which was the Haitian Creole word met, which essentially means dude or chief, right? And so that's the word that appears in the actual survey, but when they were administering the survey and asking out loud to the survey respondents, they replaced that word with the word bandi, which is what we wanted them to be asking about. So I'm happy to say more again about this in Q&A. So just a bit about our within commune selection. We divided each of the 6 communes into 250 meter by 250 meter squares, and then looked for eligible points in places that had visible houses on Google Earth. And then of these eligible points, we randomly selected the number of places to field in proportion to their violence exposure. So this in general shows the geography of the Port-au-Prince region. You'll note that or maybe you might be familiar with the fact that it's very mountainous and sits along the ocean. And so this shows all of our cluster location starting points. And then within each of the clusters, we conducted 12 surveys. And for the purposes of this talk, I'll just say that we conducted surveys of 6 men and 6 women in each of the clusters. So what do we actually find? Well, we first asked questions about kind of general approval for lynching or community justice versus relying on the state justice system. And we found in general that respondents would prefer to use state justice rather than relying on community justice. And so in this kind of general question, we found that approval for lynching versus the state justice was relatively low, right? However, when we asked about specific crimes, and the question actually asked people to report whether lynching is an appropriate punishment for either a murder in their neighborhood or a theft in their neighborhood, we find that once we ask about a specific crime, support increases, right? So we take this as evidence that their public support for lynching, again, particularly when we ask about specific serious crimes like lynching and theft, that is quite widespread. We also note that there's some interesting gender differences, that women might actually feel more vulnerable to theft and therefore are more supportive actually of lynching for thieves than are men in this context. And just to provide some additional evidence from our focus group context, this is a focus group respondent from one of our focus groups that we conducted in September of 2019. And this person reports, if a thief were to be killed in my neighborhood, we presented the same kind of hypothetical scenario in our focus group. He said, I would say that the neighbors had actually done something good. The lynching was for all of us. We don't need to tolerate thieves. Once a thief steals, he needs to be punished. This is good justice. Right. And I should say, again, this is in the backdrop of a situation where the criminal justice system is really completely failed. Right. We saw in a lot of the kind of qualitative data that we collected that respondents often gave answers that were quite similar to this, right? That there was a lot of concern that without a very kind of strict and robust and harsh response to something like theft, that a thief might come back, right? They might be known as a neighborhood where this kind of thing was allowed. And so a very harsh response was required for a kind of deterrent effect. We then turned to trying to get at measuring both state and non-state support and state and non-state legitimacy. And again, these things are very difficult to operationalize. And so we did so in a variety of ways. I'm happy to talk more about why we decided to do these things, but we ended up asking questions about whether it was important for the Haitian government to collect taxes and whether Haiti should reinstate its military, right? Haiti's military was disbanded in 1995. Since we fielded, actually, Haiti has kind of reinstated kind of a small segment of its military, but at the time that we fielded this question was very top of mind. So we took this as 2 proxies for trying to get at whether the respondent is kind of generally supportive of the Haitian state. We also asked about degrees of legitimacy. So here we had the respondent answer a question about a dispute with a neighbor that couldn't be settled on their own. And then we asked them who they would turn to for assistance. And we had a long list of responses. The most common answers I've listed here, which were the police, religious leaders, gangs, neighbors, and the UN. Again, at the time, the UN had a more active mission than they currently have. But we tried to measure, again, a degree, the level of legitimacy of each of these actors by asking whether people would sort of entrust their dispute to those responses. And lastly, we asked about gang support. We asked people whether they thought gangs did more harm than good for the people in their neighborhood. So before I tell you about what we found in terms of correlations between those responses, as I mentioned at the outset, I think one of the more interesting things that we did as part of this book is a census of basic service provision. And here, again, we're taking this basic service provision as essentially a proxy measure for good governance provided by a variety of different potential service providers. And we find here, including things like the church, or international and local NGOs, and the UN mission, which at the time was called MINUSTA. I think a few things come out of this particular figure. First is that gangs actually are reported to have provided all three types of non-security services, right? We would expect gangs to provide security services, right? But we had respondents report that they were providing even things like sanitation, road repair, and water in the areas that they control. We also find that gangs are the most cited provider of both security services and sanitation, which again, I think was somewhat of a surprising finding. So I think gangs in these contexts, and this relates to a broader project that Danielle and I are working on about whether we can import some of our theories that help us understand rebels into the space to help us try to understand gangs. But I think it's important to note that gangs in this context are actually both political and criminal, right? They do many of the things that we actually, as political scientists, more frequently ascribe to rebel organizations, including things like, importantly for this talk, providing basic governance activities, right, like road repair and sanitation. They're also heavily involved in local politics, including in electioneering and campaigning. That's not to understate how violent gangs are, but it's just to point out that it's more complicated than simply gangs are just bands of thugs, right, doing only violent activities. I also just wanted to say a very brief word about public legitimacy. Again, particularly coming from the perspective of someone who has, for most of my career, studied rebel organizations. And in the study of rebel groups, it's sort of taken for granted that rebel groups need some degree of public legitimacy in order to function. And so folks in the audience may be wondering, why does a gang need public legitimacy to function? And so one of the things that we tried to argue in this broader project is that legitimacy are also important to gangs of the sort that we observe in this Haitian context, right? That gangs actually need public legitimacy in order to function, that they often depend deeply on community support. And I do want to say that this community support may be coerced, right? But they often depend on that community support. And in particular, it's because they depend on community support for community members not to serve as kind of informants, right, either to the police or to rival gangs. This is a photograph of a gang leader, actually a former police officer, who is also a hero in his local neighborhood, right? He's being carried around on the shoulders of someone from his local neighborhood. So just as an example, again, from our focus groups, respondents reported that lots of legitimacy. Gangs can hold a lot of legitimacy, in part because gangs provide a large degree of protection. So this woman said, they protect my husband when he's driving home. They block people who aren't from our neighborhood. This is really a good thing, right? All right. So Just to kind of summarize, the tables are all in the book, but they're a little bit hard to show in slide form. So I'm just going to summarize our statistical results in narrative form here and just say that we show, again, this kind of correlation between state and gang legitimacy and public approval for lynching. So kind of 4 important findings. And I know I'm running low on time, so I just have one more slide after this. We find first that when the state is viewed as providing effective governance, then respondents see it as legitimate, right, as would be expected, and also view gangs as not very legitimate. And also, these views are correlated with disapproval of lynching. But I think the really interesting findings here are that when the state is seen as providing poor governance, state legitimacy is also degraded, right? People are less likely to see the state as legitimate, but also gang legitimacy is sort of unaffected. I think this is also interesting because when we started this project, we expected to see more of something kind of zero sum, and we don't really see that, right? On the second point, we also see that support for lynching increases. Third, we find that when gangs provide services, this increases perceptions of gang legitimacy. Similarly, doesn't really seem to affect perceptions of state legitimacy. But for those who see gangs as legitimate, they're far more likely to approve of lynching as appropriate. Throughout both of these sets of findings, we argue that the state is really seen by the public, even though it has largely retreated from these spaces, as the actor that ought to be providing governance, right? I think this is sort of a hopeful underbelly to all of the work that we've done in some of these areas. And finally, we find that under conditions of self-help, which is to say when really no one is providing basic social services in particular pockets of some of the communities that we studied, really neither the state nor the gangs are seen as legitimate. And here is where we find some of the highest levels of support for lynching. All right, so this is my final slide. The core finding of this study is, again, that there's a really, I think, fascinating correlation between weak formal institutions, even those that are completely unrelated to security, like water provision and sanitation, that is also associated with public support for lynching. We argue that the kind of broad support and also the group participation in lynching makes it a particularly difficult problem to curb. We know from the broader literature, including many very disturbing studies done in the US context, that there can be extremely long-term negative social and political consequences to lynching, which makes this a very important policy problem in the contemporary world when we're thinking about the long term. I also want to say that ending lynching, thinking about curbing lynching, curbing the problem of lynching, it's not just a matter of legal prohibition, right? Lynching is illegal in Haiti. It still happens on a widespread scale. Other scholars have argued that really 3 conditions have to be met in order to curb lynching, including the ability of the state to enforce a monopoly on violence, popular acceptance of this monopoly, and also the belief that the criminal justice system will enforce the law and punish criminals, right? So for a place like Haiti, this is a very tall order, which is part of why it's such a difficult problem to curb. And finally, I want to just say that I think for some future research and something that we explore kind of briefly in the book, but I think is a really interesting question for future research, is to think about the difference between state capacity and state legitimacy. And what we end up arguing in the book is that the key here is really perceptions of the state as legitimate, not necessarily the presence of the state. One of the things that came out of this UN report that I mentioned on lynching in the Haitian context is that reports of lynching are actually more common, more frequent, where there is more of a police presence than in places where there's less of a police presence. So it's not just that the police are there, right? It's also that the public views the police as legitimate, which ultimately leads us to argue at the end of the book that the key to curbing lynching is really fostering trust in the justice system. And this is as important as the institutions of the state themselves. Right. And I will end there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dara, for a wonderful presentation. Definitely a highly recommended book. I encourage everyone to read it. And we have about 15 minutes, so for the Q&A or a little bit more. So if you, could you please raise your virtual hand if you have any questions for Dara? Maddie. Hi, Maddie.
Hi. I just want to ask, like, with legitimizing, like, the state, like, as, like, some, like, an actor that can, like, enforce justice, wouldn't that include sort of, like, criminalizing the people who are doing the lynching? And, like, how does that affect, like, the public perception of, like, state justice?
Yeah, well, that's a little bit what I was getting at towards the end of the talk. I think in the Haitian context, at least, the participating in lynching and is illegal, right? But it's either not well understood that it's illegal or completely, well, I should say, and completely unenforced. So one of the things that the UN has done to try to mitigate the problem of lynching are public education campaigns for billboards and radio announcements to try to have people understand the law, both in terms of, it's illegal to participate, it's illegal to witness it and not report it, to try to kind of curb lynching in that way. But it's so far does not seem to have really worked, in part because it's not paired with a functioning justice system, right? So as I mentioned, a lot of people feel that it's, even though they would prefer the state to step in, they feel that they have no other choice, and in fact have to engage in quite violent episodes of community justice in order to almost serve as a deterrent for crime in their local communities.
Hi, are there any other questions? Yeah, I see a question from David Skarberg. Please go ahead.
Hey, Dara, congrats on the book. It's a great project. Really interested in your talk. I guess I had sort of a similar question to the last one, which is sort of relationship between state capacity and legitimacy. And you can imagine that as you get more state capacity, you get more legitimacy. But I'm curious, I think Nicholas Smith has some work in a different context showing that sort of more state capacity, more rule of law, more due process undermines legitimacy and increases lynching. So what's your understanding of the sort of need for more state capacity? Can we get more of both, or is there going to be some sort of fundamental contradiction in those?
Yeah, thanks for coming, first of all, and thanks also for the question. Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and we have been in conversation with Nick Rush-Smith about his important work in the South African context. I can say, the Haitian context in some ways is especially complicated because the justice. It's not just that the police are mistrusted, but also that the entire criminal justice system is largely failed, right? So I think that's why the finding here is especially kind of stark, which is that just the mere presence of police in a neighborhood, as I suggested earlier, is actually correlated with an increase in lynching rather than a decrease in lynching. So I can imagine other contexts where the police are maybe not so clearly in collusion with either the state or with criminal actors, where greater police presence would be something of a substitute for community justice, but not in these neighborhoods. And in some ways, it's coming out of some of our qualitative data, the perspective of the residents of these neighborhoods was that this is both a more reliable method for tamping down crime, but also there's a lot of, because the criminal justice system is so deeply failed in the Haitian context, even if one were to report a crime to the police and a criminal were to be arrested, people have really quite legitimate fears that the person would be released from prison and then come back and enact revenge. And so it's really an act not just of deterrence for future crime, but an act of self-protection, where it's not really even safe to report crime because people are so afraid that someone would come and punish them for reporting. So I think in that way, I guess is all to say that the Haitian context, which is the context that I have studied most closely, in some ways might be particularly complex and extreme, but it does suggest that there's not a kind of easy trade-off between increased capacity and a decrease in lynching.
Thank you. I see a question in the chat by Gemma Santamaria, and she is a former visiting fellow here at Kellogg, and she asked, could you please expand on the gender dimension of lynching in Haiti beyond women's support for this practice? Do they perpetrate these acts as well? And how do they compare to male participation?
Thank you for that question, Gemma. I am completely fascinated by that question. And I really actually would love for my next major book project, once travel is allowed again, to actually go and conduct in-depth interviews of the type that I did for my first book on wartime rape, to try to really understand from the perspective of perpetrators, both men and women, why and how they decide to, get involved in acts of lynching. For this project, we, for a variety of kind of logistical and ethical reasons, actually don't ask directly for people's for the respondents to, either in the surveys or in the focus groups, to talk about their own participation in acts of lynching. We only talk about whether people view lynching as appropriate and whether they have kind of a general approval, but not whether they themselves have participated. So we don't have direct evidence from the data that we collected as part of this project. Now, that said, from all the reading that we've done and from the cross-national data that we've collected and from some of the data that we can kind of extrapolate from the Haitian context, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, lynching largely does seem to be a form of violence that is perpetrated by the young men of a neighborhood against suspected criminals that are often young men, often but not always young men. And so there are a couple of examples in the book that we talk about. There were like a pair of thieves that were lynched by the community, where one of the suspected thieves was a woman, and she was lynched right alongside the man who was a suspected thief. In terms of the perpetrators, I'm also very interested in this, in part because of some of my previous work on women's involvement in rebel groups and just sort of violent women who are engaged in political violence more broadly. And so from the best that we can tell, or that I can tell based on the research that we've been able to do so far, women's involvement in a lot of these contexts is sort of encouraging the violence and witnessing it, but not necessarily engaging in the direct perpetration of the violence. But I think you've really hit on something that I agree is a really, really interesting question. I guess the one last thing I'll say, and this also comes out in our book, there are forms of lynching both in the Haitian context and around the world that primarily target women. And this is something that not really political scientists so much have written about, but other social science disciplines, including anthropologists. So women that are suspected of witchcraft, or people that are suspected of witchcraft, are frequently women. And so that does seem to be a kind of precipitating crime that is highly gendered, where women are more likely to be the victims of sort of group violence. But for the most part, again, it seems to be a form of violence by and against men. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thanks, Dara. I see Scott and also Luis have questions. If you don't mind, can we collect both of their questions and then you could provide an answer? So Scott?
I have a quick question too.
Okay, yes. And then Guillermo Trejo. Go ahead, Scott.
Great, thank you. Great to see you, Dara. Thanks for your excellent talk and congratulations on the book. Maybe two quick things. First of all, to begin where you ended, that fostering trust in the justice system is key. But how do you do that? I mean, these justice systems just fail dismally. I remember, and Guillermo could correct me if I'm off a bit, but in some countries, only 2 to 5% of people who commit homicides are found guilty by the justice system. And so it seems a very far stretch to, I mean, it just takes a massive change in these justice systems for citizens to reasonably have trust in them. The second, I am a big fan of within country research designs, but I guess I'm quite surprised nevertheless to hear how you began, which is you said that poverty, development, I would have expected that your argument, I don't see a reason why it shouldn't work cross-nationally. Why shouldn't the trust in the justice system or the state capacity in the justice system, why shouldn't they explain cross-national variance?
If you don't mind, Dara, can I collect just Luis's question? Go ahead, Luis.
Yeah, thanks, Dara. This was a really interesting presentation. I was wondering, in lines of that question about the enforcement of lynching, which, if I understood correctly, is almost non-existent, right? But I was wondering if you think that enforcement of lynching itself would be enough, or if it would have by itself, if it would be like sufficient to decrease public support. Because as someone who does research with prosecutors, I can easily imagine that their solution is always, we just need to enforce the law. We need to make sure that lynchers are punished. But your findings point to something a little bit broader than that, right? It's not just that lynchers are not punished, but that the state is failing to provide services that people need to even find the state as a legitimate actor. So an intuitive solution that law enforcement field might suggest, which is just to punish lynchers, would maybe not be enough to deal with the situation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, in terms of solutions, if you think that enforcement of lynching, how big of an effect it would have.
Yes, Dara, would you like to respond now? Can we collect one more question and maybe it's related? I'm hoping, since this is so interesting. Guillermo, go ahead.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you, Dara, for a great talk, for a great second book. A very quick question about the decision-making process of the lynching. I'd love to know whether there's rules, unwritten rules in the gang, levels of participation of communities. Are these decisions that are mostly taken by the gangs and within the gangs by gang leaders? Or are communities involved, not just as bystanders, but in the decision-making process? Thank you.
Okay, Dara, yeah, you have quite a long list there.
Yes. Yes, thank you so much for all of those excellent questions. I think I'll go backwards. So to the final question about the decision-making process of lynching, yeah, I mean, it's actually a quite complicated question, in part because there are sort of different, we end up focusing our book in particular on the subset of lynching that is perpetrated by sort of ordinary citizens in a neighborhood against suspected criminals. But there are other episodes of lynching that are perpetrated actually by kind of more formal self-defense groups, these brigades that I mentioned, that are much more organized. And there, the crime might be reported to the brigade, and then the brigade would go and kind of locate the perpetrator and punish them. And so that's sort of a midway between this kind of totally spontaneous response by a community, right? A woman says that her purse was snatched, and then the community sort of rises up and tracks down the killer, or tracks down the thief, and people sort of exit their homes and kill the person who is suspected of snatching the purse, versus a sort of community level investigation, and then finding the person who was accused of a particular crime. And so I think there's really a wide degree of variation in what these decision-making processes look like. And as you've suggested, in some cases also, these are committed in collusion with the gangs. So in the book, we really try to focus in particular on the subset of violence that is the most, quote, spontaneous violence, although even that is a somewhat controversial claim, because others would say that it's not so spontaneous, that the people who are involved are also themselves sometimes members of these brigades or members of the gangs or off-duty police officers or things like that. But we were primarily interested, again, in trying to get at this kind of spontaneous response to crime by non-specialists in violence. To Luis's question about enforcement of lynching, is it sufficient to, is enforcement of the laws against lynching, might that be sufficient, both to decrease public support and possibly maybe to decrease the incidence of lynching? Certainly not in the context of Haiti. Right. I mean, that's, and in part, it's because it's not coupled with a functioning justice system. So you can't just tell people that it's illegal to lynch criminals and then do nothing to deal with the core of the problem, which is that crime is rampant and there are no other choices if lynching is not happening. Right. The police are not going to step in and deal with petty theft or rape or murder or anything else. And so people feel very exposed, I think, if they were not to kind of use various forms of community justice. That being said, I think, part of what the UN has tried to do in their anti-lynching campaign is at least make people aware that lynching is in fact illegal, and to, I think, try to maybe increase some of the costs for witnessing and participating. But of course, again, it doesn't deal with the root problem, which is that the justice system has completely failed. So that takes me back to Scott's question, which is about fostering trust is key, Scott said, but how can we actually do this? And there I'm going to, so we ended our book on this point, right? I think part of our goal was to try to understand what some of the correlates are for public approval, and to maybe shed light on some of the kind of key dynamics at play. But right, so the problem, and I think again this is especially maybe depressing in the Haitian context, which is that this is all against a backdrop of just a justice system that has ceased entirely to function. So how do you increase trust in a system that just simply doesn't work? So part of what we were doing as we were sort of transitioning out of writing this book and thinking about future projects is to give some thought to kind of what comes next. And I will say this again was one of the most kind of depressing parts of this project. In interviewing we interviewed some of the folks who are involved with the UN and with other NGOs who are really trying hard to kind of make the Haitian justice system work better. But it is such a tall task. So I guess the best I can say here is that is absolutely a necessary condition for curbing the problem of lynching. And there are a lot of really smart people who are genuinely dedicated to improving the conditions, but it's such a complicated problem. And unfortunately, since we did this work 2 years ago, I think the problem has gotten even more complicated as Haiti has descended further into violence. On the very final question, so I didn't on the cross-national. I guess maybe I sort of misstated the framing of the project, which was largely to say I think the most interesting question is not, why does Haiti have a lynching problem, but other country X does not, but actually to think about the fact that what distinguishes places with problems of lynching from places that don't is not whether there is kind of a functioning justice system on the level of the country, right? We could argue, for example, I gave at the beginning of the talk, right? There are lynching episodes even in Belfast, right, which has a functioning justice system. So the question is not like, is there a functioning justice system? And that's going to help us understand whether there are episodes of lynching, but rather these really micro level dynamics that help us understand contestations over authority and therefore whether we might see an episode of lynching in a particular context. So I guess it's more of a narrowing of the question rather than suggesting that, this argument wouldn't work on the cross-national level. Thanks for all the questions.
I also have a question. It's really interesting to me to see, that graph that you show on the different providers of services. And I can see how local non-governmental organizations play a really, really important role when we see, for example, water is just almost predominantly local non-governmental organizations are providing that service, but also security, sanitation, and sometimes even more so than local governments and gangs. And so I wonder, and I want to, try to see how maybe, right, potentiating the local non-governmental organizations in some areas, obviously improving also state legitimacy, but whether really in those areas where local NGOs are also governing, whether they enjoy legitimacy, maybe without decreasing the level of legitimacy of the state. And what does your study, could say about that in terms of maybe in those areas where local non-governmental organizations govern predominantly, maybe support for lynching is lower. And I wonder what is your sense of the role of non-governmental organizations also to reduce support for lynching and improving security more general.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent observation about that that census of the security or the basic service provision, and that was also, I think, a really eye-opening part of the project for us. Every time we get on a plane to go to Port-au-Prince, it is filled with volunteers for all kinds of organizations, church organizations, NGOs, who are going to try to improve some of these problems on the ground. And yet in the neighborhoods where we were conducting the census, a non-trivial proportion of people actually say that they don't receive services from anywhere, right? And so a lot of these services aren't reaching the people that they are the most vulnerable people. I think the interesting thing to note, I think you're right that the NGOs are providing things like water, but NGOs are not very frequently reported for providing security, right? And so that, I think, is one of the sort of that's one of the reasons why I think the NGOs can in some ways help to certainly enjoy their own degree of legitimacy, and in partnering with maybe state organizations could help sort of spread that legitimacy to some other types of institutions. But really the security provision, which is really top of mind for most of the people in these areas, is being primarily provided by either the UN at this time, the Haitian National Police, and gangs, right? So NGOs aren't really a player so much in the provision of the kind of basic security, which I think makes them a little bit less important if we're trying to understand variation in approval for lynching.
Okay, thanks. So I don't see any other questions, but I want to say thank you so much, Dara, for this wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone for joining and staying throughout and asking questions. And Dara, I will let you to say the final word.
Yeah, and I'll just say thank you so much to everyone for the excellent questions and for inviting me to come today. It was great. I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.